Coming up on the Purposeful Podcast. If I have to do 40 hours of work to generate $1,000 of value, and then somebody just comes and hands me $1,000 that they printed off of a printing press, well, then my $1,000 is no longer worth 40 hours of work.
Yeah.
Right? The value relationship between the work, the productivity, and the store of value is obliterated.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of the Purposeful Podcast. I'm Matt.
I am Saki.
We're really glad to have you here on the Purposeful Podcast. We're passionate about helping get you to a point in your personal financial future and financial security where you can make the kinds of decisions that allow you to live a meaningful and purposeful life. And with that in mind, we're going to do something a little different. This is, for those of you that are eagle-eyed, you'll notice that Saki and I are wearing the same clothes that we did last week. And the reason for that is that we're recording this ahead of schedule because I'm actually due to have sinus surgery before our next episode, so we won't be recording next week. So we're going to take the opportunity to get ahead of schedule here, and we're going to finally do something that we've been talking about doing for a while, which is we're going to start a review of the Bitcoin standard. And I hope I don't butcher the title, the author of the book. I'm butchering everything right now. The name of the author, I believe, is Saifadean Ammous. He is an economist and a teacher. He comes from the Austrian School of Economics. And this is really a pretty amazing book. We're going to tackle this in segments. So we're not going to try to do the entire book in this show. We're going to try first to kind of get a grip on the concept of money, because what money is, how it works, and what it's supposed to do are really fundamental to understanding the rest of the book. So we're going to start with that first. But before we get into all of that information, we're going to go ahead and kick this out to our intro.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios.
All right, thanks for being with us on this episode. So we're going to talk about money, and we're going to talk about money in the context of how it's described in the Bitcoin standard. And as we review this book, we're going to try to basically hit on some fundamentals, try to get a better understanding of what it is that we're talking about, and hopefully set the stage for the arguments about Bitcoin that are yet to come. So, brother, you have recently gotten your copy of the book and started digging into it. So what are your impressions of the first couple of chapters?
I've got it right here. And for our listeners or watchers on YouTube, they'll see me looking down and looking at it. It's the book I'll be referencing. I like to highlight certain things as I read through a book to make it easier to go back. But it's a mind opener. Was my first impression. You know, I wasn't expecting it to start off the way it did. I didn't have high expectations of it, but it really grabbed me from the start because it immediately just dives into what is money, and as a medium of exchange, you know, how money functions in our society. So it's a very intriguing start to this book.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. When I read it, struck me first how intuitive his explanation was, but it also struck me just how hard it would have been for me to articulate that before I read, because interestingly enough, if you've been with us for a while, you can go back and listen before we even started recording the video side of this podcast. If you go back on the audio side into our archive and listen to some of our earlier shows, I spoke about money conceptually and was trying to, at various times, identify what exactly money is and how it works. And now that I've read this, I thought, oh, how poorly I did in my own definition of money. But it's important to understand. I had a conversation. I'll share this to illustrate the point that money is important to understand. So I was having a conversation with a friend, and my friend was asking me, well, why can't we just print more money? Right? Like, if I don't have much and you could make more money and give it to me, wouldn't that be a good thing? And it struck me that, financial literacy in the country is actually at a fairly low level, because this is a person who is pretty smart, hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings in their retirement account, somebody who does good practices and who is not an unintelligent person by any means. And yet they're asking me a question that I found to be somewhat absurd, but I don't mean that in an insulting way. It was just like, how can you ask that question? I didn't understand. But then the problem was I wasn't able to really answer the question in a way that helped my friend understand why that was a bad idea. And so I thought, well, who am I to say that financial education is that bad when I can't myself answer that question in a way that is compelling? So that's where this book starts. If I understood money then, I think I would have been able to better answer to my friend why printing money is a bad idea. Obviously, now my friend thinks printing money is a bad idea because we're all suffering from inflation.
Exactly.
But what money is, first and foremost, is it's a store of value and it's a means of exchange, right? So money is worth something. Otherwise, I wouldn't use it to exchange for other things of value. If I took my junk mail, which is also ink printed on paper, and I went to Saki and I said, look, Saki, I have a fat stack for you. I'm going to give you this if you give me your new pickup truck. You're going to look at me like I'm crazy, right? Because a stack of paper with ink on it has no value to you. It's just junk mail. So what makes money money? Well, money has value. It's a store of value. And so a certain amount of money could be eventually considered fair value for your truck. So that might be $35,000 worth of money, something like that. But for money to work efficiently, it has to have certain characteristics. So the author, and again, I hope I don't butcher his name too badly, I believe it's Dr. Ammous. He speaks about some specific characteristics that make money function. And so one of the things that he talks about is saleability, which means that I can exchange it with you.
Yeah.
Well, for something to be saleable, you have to factor in how saleable it is. So for money to be effective, I have to be able to have it with me in a way that allows me to transfer it where I am with a merchant that I'm exchanging with. So if I was using car tires as money, that wouldn't be very saleable over distance because it would be very burdensome for me to carry 5 or 6 car tires around on my back while I was heading out to the local farmer's market to buy some eggs and some bread, right? So you've got to factor that in. Another factor is money needs to be divisible. You know, another problem with using car tires for money is that they're not very divisible. A car tire is a large item, and how do I subdivide it? You know, what if we're using a car tire as money and I'm trying to buy a loaf of bread from you? Well, what if a loaf of bread isn't worth an entire car tire? Well, how do I cut that up into pieces? And once I start cutting it up, how do you know the quality or the value of the piece of the car tire relative to the entire car tire? It becomes a problematic issue. The other thing that you have to factor is how well does it hold its value or saleability over time? So bread is a great example in this case. If I have bread today that's freshly baked, then it has value today. But in 5 days, it's probably pretty stale and maybe a little hard. And so maybe it's not as good as fresh baked bread. And maybe after 10 days, it's moldy and it's no longer valuable at all. So bread does not do a good job of maintaining its value over a long period of time because it breaks down and degrades and eventually becomes worthless. So good money needs to be valuable and it needs to be saleable over distances. It needs to be divisible into units that are small enough to be worth exchanging for small goods, but also scalable enough that you are able to exchange large amounts of it for large goods, you know, so that you can buy an apple or you can buy a car with the same money. And then you have to factor in how well does it hold its value over time. So those are some important factors of money. The author also talks about the concept of hardness, and that's where I'm going to pass it over to you, and then maybe you can give us your thoughts on that.
So he talks about hardness and money being hard, money being easy, right?
Right.
And easy money, and the way I interpreted what he was talking about is hard money has to be tied to something, right? To give it that value. What's it backed by? What makes the small seashell worth a small seashell and a big one worth a big one, right? And he correlates that with the longevity of that currency, of that money, which is something I've never actually thought about. So easy money, as he talks about it, is money that's not really tied to anything. And over time, over a long period of time, easy money will just go away, right? It loses its store of value. It's either not efficient to trade, there's not enough demand for it, the market doesn't become big enough. So you end up replacing that easy money with another form of currency, another form of money. But hard money is tied to something, is in high demand, is easily divisible, and the audience for that grows. And as that audience grows and more people accept that, it actually becomes a better currency to use.
Right. And to clarify that, the hard and the easy money concept, the author talks about ancient currencies. And in the ancient past, most societies were relatively small and relatively isolated. So things that could be used as money in those sorts of societies are different from the sorts of things that might make good money today. And the reason is because of easy and hard money. And here's the example. So for those of you that are longtime listeners of this program, you know that we live in Northwest Florida. So we're not very far away from the beach. And one thing that is prominent at the beach is fragments of seashells. We get a lot of seashells at the beach. Well, one of the ancient societies that the author talks about used seashells as a form of money. Well, in a closed society and in a certain environment, seashells in this case were not very easy to come by. So they were valuable, but they had hardness because it's not like you could just walk down to the beach and get a lot more seashells. These particular seashells were difficult to come by. And so they retained their value as a means of exchange. What happened eventually is that this society was met by outsiders. I believe it was the English. And in this particular case, the folks that were coming into this society realized, oh, well, seashells are easy for us to get, and they're cheap for us to produce. So we'll go out and collect a bunch of seashells, and then we'll come and we'll exchange them for other things that we find to be valuable. And so the money that this society was using became easy money instead of hard money, because once this society started interacting outside of its local confines, seashells were no longer scarce. They were very easy to come by. And so what happened is basically the amount of currency in circulation shot up very quickly, and there was a massive transfer of wealth from this society to the traders that came and exchanged the currency for the goods or services. And so eventually what happened is the seashells became useless as currency because they were too easy. It was just way too easy to go get more seashells. Yeah. So they didn't retain their value like they did when it was a hard currency. So that was kind of how that concept worked. And that's a good primer for understanding inflation in a sense, right? Because a very good money would be a money that is not easily produced. And in that sense, it would be considered a hard money. And the harder a money is, the more it retains its value over time. And that then becomes a better kind of money.
Yeah, so what I was going to respond to you with was, and I was in the same boat as you. I never had a real good answer when I was posed a question about what happens when we print money? Why do we print money, or why can't we print money? Well, and there's the start of the response right there, right? Because when we print money, it turns hard money into easy money. It's creating more supply. And on a fundamental level, easy money devalues because there's more supply, right? Simple supply and demand. And when I read this first couple chapters in this book, I mean, you're right. The way he words it it just allowed me to understand that a little more clearly. And if there's a finite number of something, typically the value of that increases over time, which makes it hard, whether that's money, collectibles, anything, right? Cars. But anything you see that's mass produced or continuously produced becomes easy, because you can go on any corner and get, a loaf of bread or something like that. So it clarified that for me. But that's a way we could respond to that question in the future is why not print money? Oh, because it makes it become easy money at that point.
Right. And the relationship between money and value is where that really kind of opened my eyes. We think about money almost in terms of what it does for us, but when you think about money not as a means to an end, but as a store of value, and this hits close to home as an entrepreneur, and I'm sure it does for you too, right? When you're just getting started in whatever business you're in, you learn real quickly the value of your time, and you learn real quickly the value of a dollar, because you're actually doing work and figuring out how to translate that work into something that's valuable enough that someone will give you money for it.
Yep.
And when you're not very refined at producing value, for example, when I was 11 or 12 years old and I would go through the neighborhood and shovel snow off of my neighbors' sidewalks and driveways, right? That was useful. That was useful. But I could do 3 or 4 hours worth of work, and if I was lucky, I might come away with $15 or $20. And what you learn is that shoveling snow is not the most valuable use of my time. Like, there are other things that I can do that will produce more value than shoveling snow. So you think to yourself, well, what kind of skills might those be? And then you pursue the acquisition of those kinds of skills. And then ultimately, you start to think about money intuitively as a store of value. And then you realize why you can't just print it indefinitely, because if I have to do 40 hours of work to generate $1,000 of value, and then somebody just comes and hands me $1,000 that they printed off of a printing press, well, then my $1,000 is no longer worth 40 hours of work.
Yeah.
Right? The value relationship between the work, the productivity, and the store of value is obliterated. And that's what we see with inflation. Money comes into the market, and there was no work, there was no productivity associated with the entry of that money into the economy. It was just produced out of thin air. So the effect is to destroy the relationship between the production and the store of value, and that's what makes it so insidious.
Yeah. One of the early chapters, he kind of speaks to that, and I'm going to just read this last sentence here, and it's referring to a certain instance they were talking about, but it says, a money that is easy to produce is no money at all, and easy money does not make a society richer. On the contrary, it makes it poorer by placing all its hard-earned wealth for sale in exchange for something easy to produce. So Think about that, and it doesn't sound like much, but when you get into that couple lines there, that goes into there's a lot going on there. That goes into what you were just talking about with value of your time. And as an entrepreneur, that pretty much sums up our whole life, right? All we're looking for is value, right? Whether it's value of product, value of services, value of time. As a real estate investor, I'm looking for the highest and best use of a particular property, right?
Right.
What am I looking for? I'm looking for the best value. So the more that is in there, there's less value. So it's pretty interesting stuff. It really gets the mind going.
Absolutely. And I think that's a pretty good place to wrap this up. There's a lot of technical information there.
Yeah.
If you want to know more, it might be worth listening to it once or twice. And it's also worth getting the book. I mean, that's the first takeaway. Whether you end up agreeing with what the author says about Bitcoin or not with regard to its potential value, the education that you get on the front end of the book in and of itself makes it worth buying the book, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I'll add to that this book here, you might not necessarily agree with it, but it is a book that should be read.
There you go. Matt and Psyche's Book Club on the Purposeful Podcast. Well, sounds good. Well, if you are interested in that, if you're our listener or our viewer and you'd like us to read a particular book, or you'd like to know more about this one, you can reach us at the Purposeful Podcast at convergentdigitalmedia.com. Send us an email, send us a message, leave us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. If you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble, please subscribe to our feed and make sure that your notifications are on so you know when we put out new content. If you want to do so, we also encourage you to leave some comments or feedback there. We read those and we look forward to hearing from you there. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast directory, please subscribe to our feed there. And if you're listening on Apple, if you're listening on Google Podcasts, if you're listening on Spotify, please leave us a 5-star review. Please leave us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you there as well. For now, we're going to call it an episode. We invite you back. We will be doing more of the Bitcoin Standard. And we look forward to having you with us on the Purposeful Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to join us on Locals at thepurposefulpodcast.locals.com and find us on YouTube and Rumble by searching for the Purposeful Podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and review. This has been a production of Convergent Digital Media. Visit convergentdigitalmedia.com for more info. Thanks again for listening to the Purposeful Podcast.